I had barely shut my truck door when I saw it. A pearl-white luxury SUV parked sideways across my inherited driveway, perfectly centered, like it was placed there on purpose, not half in. Not sloppy, just enough to make a statement. I was still gripping my aunt's house keys when the front door next door swung open, and a woman stepped out as if she'd been waiting for me all morning. She walked straight over, clipboard tucked under her arm, wearing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask my name. She just told me, flat and confident, that I was in violation. According to her, this driveway wasn't mine. According to her, the house I'd spent every summer in as a kid was still under HOA review. And according to her, if I didn't cooperate immediately, fines would start piling up before nightfall. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this house wasn't just sentimental. It was legally mine. Properly inherited, fully documented. And I didn't just know the law. I enforced it for a living. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Alder Ridge Lane sits on the quiet edge of Briarfield, Missouri, the kind of place where evenings are slow and the loudest sound is usually a lawn sprinkler clicking on at dusk. The house at the end of the lane stood out immediately. It always had, while the rest of the neighborhood was made up of identical beige homes with matching mailboxes and trimmed hedges. My aunt's house was older, sturdier, and full of character. It had been built decades before the HOA ever existed, back when the land was still open and people built homes instead of units. That house belonged to my Aunt Eleanor Finch. After my parents passed, she was the one who stepped in without hesitation. Summers at her place were a constant in my childhood. Lemonade on the porch, wind chimes clinking in the evenings, a garden she tended like it was sacred ground. When she passed, leaving the house to me, it felt less like an inheritance and more like a responsibility to protect something that had already survived so much. I moved back temporarily to handle her estate and make sure the place didn't get swallowed up by paperwork or opportunists. I told myself it would be quiet. A few weeks of sorting documents, fixing small things around the house, and saying goodbye properly. What I didn't expect was that the Alder Ridge Estates Association had apparently decided the house was theirs to control. The subdivision had grown up around my aunt's property years after her home was built. The HOA paperwork, which I hadn't even seen yet, clearly showed their boundaries stopped short of her lot. But standing there in the driveway that first day, listening to Darlene Whitlock speak, you would never know that. She carried herself like a badge gave her authority, even though all she held was a clipboard and a pen. She didn't acknowledge my loss. She didn't say she was sorry for my aunt. She went straight into listing problems. The paint on the porch railing was non-compliant. The fence in the backyard was half a foot too high. The grass along the side of the house was approaching violation length. She spoke fast, confident, like she'd practiced the routine countless times. Something about it immediately set off alarms in my head, not because of what she said, but how she said it. There was no uncertainty, no checking records, just assumptions and authority delivered like facts. Still, I didn't correct her. I didn't tell her who I was or what I did for a living. I wanted to see how far she'd push when she thought she had the upper hand. I nodded, said I'd look into it, and went inside. That night, after the house finally grew quiet, I started unpacking boxes in the spare bedroom. That's when I found it. A plain cardboard folder tucked behind an old bookshelf, thick enough that it barely fit on the shelf. My aunt's handwriting was on the front, neat but shaky toward the end. Inside were years of HOA notices. Page after page, violation letters, final warnings, threats of fines, claims of liens that never appeared in county records. Each letter was more aggressive than the last. I sat on the bed flipping through them, my chest tightening with every page. My aunt had paid thousands of dollars over the years, not because she was wrong, but because she was tired. Tired of fighting. tired of letters, tired of being watched. Then I found the letter that changed everything. A lawyer's letter dated years earlier, clearly stating that the property was not part of the Alder Ridge Estates Association and never had been. It was official, clear, undeniable. My aunt had known. She had proof, and yet the notices never stopped. That's when the story stopped being about rules or paint colors. It became about power. Someone had seen an older woman living alone at the edge of a subdivision and decided she was an easy target. Someone had counted on her choosing peace over conflict. Sitting there in that quiet room, surrounded by boxes that still smelled faintly like her lavender soap, I realized I hadn't just inherited a house. I had inherited a fight she was too tired to finish. I sat at the kitchen table long after midnight, the house silent except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. One by one, I went through every letter my aunt had saved. I didn't skim them. I read them carefully, slowly, the way you read something when you're trying to understand how far back the damage really goes. Each notice followed the same pattern, a formal heading, official-sounding language, a violation that was vague enough to be hard to argue but specific enough to sound serious. Paint inconsistencies, landscaping issues, unauthorized structures. Then came the threats. Late fees, escalating penalties, mentions of liens and legal action that, as far as I could tell, never actually happened. What did happen was payment. Check stubs, bank statements, proof that my aunt had written check after check just to make the letters stop. By the time I reached the bottom of the stack, my hands were shaking. It wasn't hundreds of dollars. It wasn't even a few thousand. Over the years, it added up to tens of thousands of dollars. Money she could have used for repairs, for medical care, or simply to make her life easier. Instead, she paid for silence, for temporary peace, for the hope that if she complied just one more time, they would finally leave her alone. Then I found the document that made my stomach drop. It was a letter from a local attorney, dated years back, written in clear, careful language. It stated that the property on Alder Ridge Lane was never part of the Alder Ridge Estates Association. It referenced plat maps, filing dates, and county records. There was no ambiguity, no loophole. The conclusion was blunt. The HOA had no authority over the property, and any attempts to fine or threaten the homeowner were unenforceable. My aunt had known. She had proof in her hands, and still the harassment continued. That's when the sadness I'd been carrying since her funeral finally hardened into something else. Grief gave way to anger. Not loud anger, focused anger. The kind that settles in your chest and doesn't leave until something is set right. The next morning, I stepped outside with a cup of coffee and saw a bright yellow paper taped directly to my front door. A fresh violation notice. It cited an unregistered vehicle parked overnight in violation of community standards. The vehicle in question was my truck, the same truck sitting on my driveway. The driveway attached to a house that wasn't even part of their HOA. It wasn't subtle. It was a test. I walked next door and knocked. Darlene answered almost immediately, like she'd been waiting. She looked pleased, like someone checking off a task on a to-do list. I told her calmly that there had been a mistake. I showed her the lawyer's letter. I explained that the property wasn't under HOA jurisdiction and never had been. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I just laid out the facts. She barely glanced at the paperwork. She waved a hand and smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. Then she said it, quietly, casually, like she was offering friendly advice. It's easier if you just cooperate. There it was, the truth, stripped of all the polite language and fake authority. She wasn't enforcing rules. She was enforcing compliance. She wasn't interested in whether the HOA had power. She was counting on me believing she did. I asked her directly if she knew the property wasn't part of the association. She paused for half a second, just long enough. Then she said it didn't matter, that the house benefited from HOA standards, that resisting would only make things uncomfortable, that neighbors didn't like troublemakers. I thanked her for her time and walked back to my house, the violation notice still folded in my hand. Standing in the living room, surrounded by my aunt's furniture and memories, I finally understood what she had been up against. It wasn't confusion. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was pressure. Constant, calculated pressure designed to wear someone down until paying felt easier than fighting. And that's when I made a decision. I wasn't going to argue with her. I wasn't going to explain myself again. And I definitely wasn't going to cooperate just to keep the peace, because this wasn't about rules. It was about control, and control only works when the other person believes they have no choice. The change was subtle at first, but impossible to ignore once I noticed it. Neighbors who had waved the day I arrived suddenly found reasons to look the other way. Conversations that drifted across driveways would stop the moment I stepped outside. If I walked toward the mailbox, people checked their phones. If I watered the lawn, garage doors quietly rolled shut. It felt coordinated, like someone had flipped a switch. A few days later, I found out why. A neighbor I barely recognized stopped me long enough to whisper that there was a post circulating in the community group online. I didn't even need to read it to know who wrote it. When I finally did, my jaw tightened. The post never accused me outright, not in plain language. It didn't have to. It asked questions, suggested concerns, implied that I might not be the rightful owner of the house, wondered aloud whether the inheritance paperwork was verified, urged residents to be cautious. It was character assassination dressed up as community concern. Dozens of people reacted to it. Likes. Agreement. A few comments about how rules existed for a reason. Nobody asked for proof. Nobody defended me. Silence, I realized, was easier than becoming the next target. The only person who didn't avoid me was Harold Benton. Harold lived 2 houses down, in a modest place with a sagging porch and a bird feeder that was always full. He was a retired widower with a slow walk and sharp eyes, the kind of man who had seen enough of life to recognize patterns when they repeated. One afternoon, he waved me over while I was bringing groceries inside. "You're getting the treatment," he said quietly. We sat on his porch, and he told me what the rest of the street wouldn't. Darlene had been doing this for years, picking people who lived alone, people without the energy or money to fight. She used paperwork, pressure, and the fear of being isolated to get what she wanted. According to Harold, my aunt had been her longest-running target. She figured Eleanor was safe, he said. No husband. No kids living nearby. She thought your aunt would always choose peace. That sentence stuck with me, because it explained everything I'd found in that folder. The letters, the payments, the exhaustion written between the lines. Harold admitted he regretted not speaking up sooner. Most people did. Darlene had a way of making dissent feel dangerous, even if she never said it outright. The HOA didn't need to threaten everyone. It only needed to make an example of a few. That night, I ordered security cameras. Not because I wanted drama, but because I wanted facts. I mounted them carefully. One covering the driveway, one facing the street, one watching the side yard. I made sure they were visible. Bullies behave differently when they know there's a record. At the same time, I started building a file. Not a messy stack of papers like my aunt had kept, but a clean, organized record. Dates, times, photos, screenshots, copies of every notice taped to my door, every message posted online, every interaction that felt even slightly off. Then I did what Darlene never expected anyone to do. I went to the county offices. I didn't make a scene. I didn't tell a story. I asked for records, deeds, plat maps, incorporation filings. I spoke with the recorder, the assessor, and the clerk. I cross-checked dates and boundaries. I compared filing numbers and signatures. I verified everything twice. The house on Alder Ridge Lane was built long before the subdivision. The plat map clearly showed the HOA boundaries stopping short of the property line. The HOA itself wasn't incorporated until years later. The parcel number for my aunt's house didn't even appear in the HOA's governing documents. It wasn't a gray area. It wasn't a technicality. It was absolute. For good measure, I contacted the HOA's management company and asked casually whether my address appeared in their system. It didn't, not even as an error. As far as the records were concerned, the house didn't exist. By the time I left the county building, I felt something I hadn't felt since the funeral. Clarity. The truth wasn't just on my side. It was undeniable. And that changed everything. Because pressure only works when the target doubts themselves, when they wonder if maybe they're wrong. Maybe it's not worth it. Maybe paying is easier. Darlene's entire operation depended on that doubt. I didn't have it anymore. As I pulled back onto Alder Ridge Lane, I noticed a few neighbors watching from their windows. I didn't wave. I didn't smile. I just parked, stepped out, and looked straight ahead. Let them wonder. Because from that moment on, I wasn't reacting anymore. I was preparing. And whether Darlene realized it yet or not, every move she made from here on out was going to be recorded, verified, and matched against the truth. And the truth, unlike intimidation, doesn't get tired. Darlene didn't give me much time to enjoy the quiet. Her biggest mistake came just a few mornings later, and it started before the sun was fully up. I stepped outside around 6 in the morning, coffee in hand, already thinking about a trip into town, and stopped cold. A black pickup truck was parked inches behind my own, close enough that I couldn't have backed out without scraping metal. It wasn't crooked or careless. It was deliberate. I already knew what I'd see when I checked the cameras. The footage showed the truck rolling in just after 3 in the morning, headlights off, moving slowly like the driver didn't want attention. It pulled in behind my truck with surgical precision. The driver stepped out, glanced toward my house, and walked straight toward Darlene's place next door. That was intimidation. Plain and simple. I didn't move the truck. I didn't knock on doors. I waited. Around 7:30, Darlene appeared like clockwork, clipboard in hand again, flanked by 2 HOA board members I hadn't met before. One avoided eye contact. The other looked uncomfortable, like he already knew this was a bad idea. Darlene announced that my vehicle was in violation of community standards and subject to immediate towing. She said it loudly, clearly, making sure anyone within earshot could hear. She talked about safety, about fairness, about how rules applied to everyone. I asked her why there was a truck blocking my driveway. She didn't answer. She said it was a community compliance vehicle. I asked who owned it. She ignored the question and told me I had 30 minutes to move my truck or it would be towed at my expense. I calmly told her she was standing on private property and had no authority there. I told her the HOA had no jurisdiction over the house. I reminded her that she had already been shown proof. She smiled again. That same thin smile. And then she said she'd already called a tow company. That's when I knew she'd gone too far. We waited. Neighbors began to drift outside, pretending to check mail or water lawns. This time they watched openly. Darlene had turned it into a show, and she wanted witnesses. The tow truck arrived about 10 minutes later. The driver stepped out, looked at the situation, and immediately frowned. He asked, "Who called it in?" Darlene stepped forward and started explaining violations in authority and community rules. The driver stopped her mid-sentence. "Is this private property?" he asked. I told him it was. He asked if I'd requested the tow. I said no. He shook his head and told her he couldn't tow a vehicle from private property without the owner's permission or a police order. He said it calmly, professionally, like someone who'd had this conversation before. Darlene snapped back that she was the HOA president and that was all the authority he needed. The driver looked at me again, studying my face a little longer this time. Then his eyes widened just a fraction. "You're Daniel Harper," he said. "County sheriff." The air changed instantly. Darlene froze. One of the board members took a step back. The other suddenly found something very interesting on his phone. A few neighbors murmured quietly. I hadn't planned to say it that way. I hadn't planned to say it at all. But the moment was already there. "Yes," I said evenly. "I am. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't flash a badge. I just let the truth sit where everyone could see it." The driver nodded once and turned back to Darlene. He told her again that he wouldn't tow my vehicle. He also told her that the truck blocking my driveway was trespassing and could be towed at my request. Darlene's confidence evaporated. She started talking faster, tripping over her words, trying to reframe the situation. She said there had been a misunderstanding, that she was just doing her job, that she hadn't known. I reminded her calmly that I had already told her the property wasn't under HOA control, that she had acknowledged it, that she had continued anyway. The driver asked if I wanted the blocking truck removed. I looked at Darlene. I looked at the board members. I looked at the neighbors watching from across the street. "No," I said, "he can move it himself." And just like that, the intimidation collapsed. The owner of the black pickup, suddenly very nervous, hurried over and climbed inside. He didn't look at anyone as he backed out and drove away. The tow truck left. The crowd dispersed. Darlene stood there for a moment, clipboard hanging uselessly at her side. She didn't apologize. She just walked back to her house. As I went back inside, one thought settled in my mind with absolute clarity. Darlene's power had never been real. It was borrowed from fear, from silence, from people assuming she couldn't be challenged. The moment someone with authority refused to play along, the whole thing cracked. And now she knew something else too. From this point on, every move she made wouldn't just be annoying, it would be evidence. Darlene didn't retreat after that morning. If anything, she became louder, bolder, like someone who realizes their bluff has been called and decides the only option left is to shove all their chips into the middle of the table. For a few days, things were quiet, almost unnervingly so. No notices. No confrontations. No clipboard appearances. I knew better than to believe it was over. Her response came on a Saturday morning, just after 9. I heard the engine before I saw it. That same pearl white SUV rolled slowly across the street and stopped directly across my driveway again, positioned with deliberate precision. This time, she didn't stay inside the vehicle. She stepped out immediately, phone in hand, voice already raised as if she were addressing an invisible crowd. And there was a crowd. Neighbors lined their driveways. Some stood on porches. A few gathered at the corner like this was entertainment. Darlene had made sure of that. She wanted witnesses. She wanted pressure. She wanted to turn this into a public spectacle where she controlled the narrative. She announced, loudly, that she was filing liens against my property. She quoted a number, over $14,000, said it represented years of unpaid violations, late fees, and penalties. She talked about legal action, about consequences, about how resistance only made things worse. She framed herself as the responsible one, burdened with enforcing rules for the good of the community. I stood on my porch and listened. When she finished, I walked down the steps and calmly asked her to move her vehicle. She refused. She said she was within her rights. She said she wasn't leaving until I acknowledged the fines, so I did the one thing she hadn't planned for. I brought out the receipts. I didn't shout. I didn't argue, I explained. I showed copies of the deed, the plat maps, the incorporation filings. I explained that the house was built long before the HOA existed. I pointed out where the HOA boundaries ended, clearly short of my property line. I mentioned that the HOA management company didn't even have my address in their system. Darlene tried to interrupt me. She tried to talk over me. But something had shifted. The neighbors were listening now. Really listening. A few brows furrowed. A few people glanced at each other. Doubt crept in. That's when I pulled out my phone. I told her, calmly, that since she was refusing to leave my private property and was blocking my driveway, I was calling the sheriff's office. Not as the sheriff, as a homeowner. Her face changed immediately. She laughed at first, sharp and forced, and told everyone I was bluffing. That she'd spoken to lawyers, that she knew the law, that I was just trying to scare her. I made the call anyway. We waited. The minutes stretched. Darlene paced. She talked faster. She repeated herself. She started arguing with people who hadn't said a word. The crowd grew quieter. A few neighbors drifted away, suddenly uncomfortable. When the patrol car pulled onto Alder Ridge Lane, the shift was instant and unmistakable. Darlene's confidence collapsed in real time. She stepped backward, fumbling with her phone, trying to explain before anyone had even spoken. The deputy stepped out, calm and professional, and asked what was going on. I let Darlene speak first. She stumbled through her explanation, mixing HOA jargon with legal threats, contradicting herself without realizing it. When she finished, the deputy turned to me. I handed over my documentation. Deeds, maps, photos, video clips from the camera showing her blocking the driveway on multiple occasions. The deputy took his time reviewing everything. Then he told Darlene she needed to move her vehicle immediately. That's when panic took over. Darlene rushed back to her SUV, flung the door open, and threw it into reverse without looking. The back end clipped my mailbox post hard enough to crack the wood, then tore across the edge of my lawn, leaving deep ruts in the grass. She stopped, stunned, halfway across the yard. The deputy saw all of it. What had been an HOA dispute seconds earlier was now something else entirely. Property damage, trespassing. Documented, witnessed, undeniable. The deputy asked her to step out of the vehicle. Her hands were shaking. Her voice dropped. She tried to apologize, tried to explain, tried to minimize what had just happened. It was too late for that. The deputy documented the damage, took photos, and wrote everything down. He told Darlene she would be hearing from the department and advised her to consult an attorney. He also made it clear, in front of everyone, that the HOA had no authority over my property. The crowd dispersed quickly after that. No cheering, no confrontation, just quiet realization. People who had nodded along with Darlene earlier now avoided eye contact. As the patrol car pulled away, I stood in my yard looking at the broken mailbox and torn grass. I felt calm. Not triumphant, not angry. Certain. Darlene had crossed the line she could never uncross. From this point forward, nothing she did would be dismissed as just HOA stuff. It was all on record now. And records have a way of telling the truth, whether people like it or not. The tow truck came back before the deputy even finished his report. Not because I asked for it, and not because I wanted a show, but because Darlene had created a situation she could no longer talk her way out of. She was parked on private property. She had damaged my mailbox. She had torn up my lawn. And now there was an officer standing there who had watched it all happen. The driver was the same one from before. He stepped out, took one look at the scene, and sighed like a man who already knew how this was going to end. The deputy nodded to him and explained the situation. Darlene tried to interrupt, but her voice didn't carry the way it used to. Not anymore. Not with half the street standing there and the illusion already shattered. When the driver hooked her SUV up and lifted the wheels off the pavement, there was a collective stillness. No one cheered. No one clapped. People just watched. Some with disbelief. Some with embarrassment. Some with the dawning realization that the person they had followed for years was not nearly as untouchable as she had made herself seem. Darlene stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed tight against her chest, face flushed with anger and panic. She kept repeating that this wasn't over, that lawyers would be involved, that everyone would regret this. But her words didn't land. They floated away, powerless without fear to back them up. When the tow truck pulled away, something fundamental changed on Alder Ridge Lane. The street didn't feel tense anymore. It felt exposed. Like a secret had finally been dragged into the open. The weeks that followed were methodical. Quiet, thorough. The sheriff's office opened a formal investigation, and this time it wasn't about one driveway or one mailbox. It was about patterns. Deputies interviewed neighbors. They spoke with Harold. They pulled HOA records. They compared violation notices with county plats. They reviewed canceled checks and bank statements going back years. What they found wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a system. Darlene had issued fines to properties she knew were outside HOA jurisdiction. She had threatened liens she had no authority to file. She had pressured homeowners into paying by isolating them socially and overwhelming them with paperwork. In my aunt's case, she had done it for over a decade, knowing full well Eleanor Finch lived alone and hated conflict. The HOA management company distanced itself quickly. Emails surfaced showing Darlene had been warned repeatedly not to pursue certain properties. She ignored them. She acted on her own. She liked the control. She liked being feared. The district attorney reviewed the file and didn't hesitate. Charges were filed: misdemeanor harassment, misdemeanor fraud, misdemeanor trespassing. Not dramatic charges, not sensational ones, but real ones. The kind that follow you. The kind that show up on background checks. The kind that don't go away just because you say you were just doing your job. Darlene's authority collapsed the moment it became expensive. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. For the first time since I'd arrived, they didn't invite the whole neighborhood. This one was closed door. By the end of it, Darlene was removed unanimously as president. Not because they suddenly grew a conscience, but because they saw the liability. Because they realized that standing behind her meant standing in front of a judge. Neighbors started talking after that, not loudly, not proudly. Quiet admissions on sidewalks. Awkward apologies that never quite became full sentences. People said they hadn't known how bad it was. Said they'd assumed someone else would step in. Said they were just trying to avoid trouble. I listened. I didn't argue. I didn't correct them, because the truth was already out. Darlene stopped appearing on Alder Ridge Lane. Her house went dark. Mail piled up. A few weeks later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. When she finally moved out, it was early in the morning, quietly, without witnesses, no clipboard, no speech, no audience. The HOA issued a carefully worded letter to residents about leadership changes and policy reviews. It never mentioned my aunt. It never admitted wrongdoing. It didn't have to. Everyone knew. Standing in my driveway one evening, watching the sun dip behind the houses, I felt something settle that I hadn't realized I'd been carrying. Not satisfaction. Not revenge. Closure. Darlene hadn't been defeated by yelling or threats or power plays. She'd been undone by records. By patience. By the simple act of refusing to be worn down. Her authority vanished the moment it stopped being free. And the street, for the first time in years, finally felt like a place where nobody was watching their mailbox for another yellow notice taped to the door. The legal process moved slower than the confrontation, but it moved with purpose. Darlene didn't get to argue her way out of it this time. The evidence spoke for itself. The paper trail was long, detailed, and unforgiving. By the time everything reached court, the story was no longer about a single block driveway or one angry HOA president. It was about years of intimidation and misuse of authority. Darlene accepted a plea deal. She was sentenced to probation, ordered to pay fines, and required to complete community service. Most importantly, she was ordered to repay a portion of the money she had taken under false pretenses. It wasn't everything my aunt had paid, and it never could be. You can't reimburse years of stress or the quiet fear of opening your mail, but the restitution mattered. It was official recognition that what had been done was wrong. Her house went up for sale not long after. The listing photos went online first, all bright lighting and neutral language, as if the walls hadn't once echoed with threats and phone calls. A few neighbors mentioned it casually, like they were talking about the weather. Others pretended not to notice. When the moving truck arrived, it was quiet. No speeches, no goodbyes. Darlene left the same way her authority had collapsed, quickly and without witnesses. The neighborhood began to change after that. Not dramatically, not overnight. But the tension that had hung in the air for years slowly lifted. People lingered longer outside. Conversations restarted. Smiles returned, tentative at first. The same neighbors who had avoided eye contact now waved and asked how I was settling in. A few admitted they felt relieved, like something heavy had finally been removed. Some apologized. Some didn't. I didn't keep score. I focused on the house. Restoring my aunt's place became a way of honoring her. I fixed the mailbox but kept the original post. I repaired the lawn but left her garden untouched. I repainted the porch railing the same soft color she liked, even though no one was there to find me anymore. Every creak of the floorboards, every faded photograph on the wall reminded me why this fight had mattered. I found her old journal tucked away in a dresser drawer one afternoon. In it, she wrote about wanting quiet, about hoping things would eventually calm down, about choosing peace, even when it cost her. She never complained. She just wrote about being tired. Reading those pages, I understood her better than I ever had before. She hadn't been weak. She had been worn down. As spring settled over Alder Ridge Lane, new people moved into Darlene's old house. A young couple with laughter in their voices and plans for a garden. They waved the first day they arrived. No clipboard, no questions. Just a simple, hello. The street felt different after that. Lighter, safer. Like a place that could finally exhale. One evening, as I sat on the porch listening to the wind chimes my aunt loved, I realized something important. The fight hadn't just protected a property. It had broken a pattern. One that relied on silence and fear to survive. The house stayed the same. The driveway stayed clear. And for the first time since I'd returned, Alder Ridge Lane felt less like contested ground and more like home. When I look back on everything that happened, I realize it was never really about bylaws or paint colors or parking rules. Bullies like Darlene don't rely on rules at all. They rely on exhaustion. They count on people getting tired of fighting, tired of letters, tired of being watched, until paying feels easier than pushing back. That's what happened to my aunt. Aunt Eleanor didn't pay those fines because she thought she was wrong. She paid because she was tired, tired of conflict, tired of stress, tired of feeling like every knock on the door might bring another problem. She chose peace the only way she thought she could afford it. I didn't blame her then, and I don't blame her now. What I did was finish what she couldn't, not out of anger and not for revenge, but because someone needed to draw a line and say that quiet intimidation doesn't get to win forever. Now the house is quiet again, the kind of quiet my aunt loved. The wind chimes still sing when the breeze comes through, just like they always did. The driveway stays clear. No yellow notices, no threats. No one watching from behind their blinds. Just a home standing exactly where it always has. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?